Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Dr. Miriam Klein Kassenoff, Director of the University of Miami Holocaust Teacher Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Miami Jewish Film Festival's virtual speaker series event. We're excited and honored to have with us this evening Dr. Michael Berenbaum, noted Holocaust historian, scholar, director of the Siggy Ziering Institute, and Dr. Stephen D. Smith, noted Holocaust and genocide scholar, and the Vinci Viterbi executive director of USC Shoah Foundation, which is the educational partner for the film that you just saw, Final Account and Focus Features. By the way, to be noted, Stephen and the film's late director, Luke Holland, were close friends. So before I begin, I know that most of you who just watched this film must have come away with mixed emotions, possibly emotions of frustration, of annoyance, of what were they thinking? And I want to tell you what my emotion was when I first saw it. When the executive director of Miami Jewish Film Festival, Igor, first called me and asked me to be moderator and part of the film and told me what it was about, I said, a film about the perpetrators? I'm going to have to listen to perpetrators? I don't think I want to do that. And he said, well, just listen to the link. So I watched the film and I knew immediately that from a professional point of view, as a Holocaust educator, as well as a child refugee survivor of the Holocaust, that this was going to be a very important historic film. And I immediately said, of course, we must show this and we must share this. And then I said, and we must have Dr. Michael Beerbaum and Dr. Stephen Smith along with us. So, with that said, I will now turn to the panel of these two scholars of Holocaust history, and I will ask an opening question, and then let Stephen and Michael have an important conversation between the two of them. So, let's start with Stephen and friend of the late director, Luke Holland. Stephen, please tell us how it is that you became involved with the history of this film production and the history of the film. And then to Michael, what was your first impression when you saw the film for the first time? And how do you see its relevance for today? Stephen, let's begin with you.
Well, thank you, Miriam, and it's a pleasure to see you again. And thank you for many years of friendship and partnership over the years. Well, you know, Miriam, I was friends with Luke, as you mentioned, because we both lived in the UK, and I was the director of the Holocaust Centre in the UK. And Luke had previously launched two very significant films. One was called Good Morning, Mr. Hitler. And it was all about color film footage and how color was used in the propaganda unit of the Third Reich. And it was just an amazing film when it came out. I think it must have been the early 90s to see the Third Reich in color, because until that point, we'd only ever seen it in black and white. And then he followed a group of Holocaust survivors. Not all slave laborers in the factories that were owned by commercial companies were eligible for restitution. And so there was a process in which a number of survivors and others were lobbying the German government for them to be included in this restitution. And so Luke followed this group of survivors from London, mainly, the ones that were in London, that is to say, for about 10 years. Long process of negotiations and so forth. And so he was a very, very serious filmmaker, and they won their case in the end. And of course, the film was very well received. So when in 2008, he called me and said, I'm thinking of going to Germany to film Nazis. If anybody else had made that call to me, I would have thought they were off their minds. But when Luke said that, I went, oh, hello, this might be a really interesting idea. I personally had always been fascinated by, those sort of accounts of Albert Speer and these sort of people, like getting to know who were these people behind the scenes. But Luke was proposing to go into their homes and interview them, not for a documentary, but to try and create an archive of what he called the final account. So a bit of background just for anybody who didn't catch Luke's biography. He was born in England. His mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany. His father was not Jewish, but they had fled from Germany to England, where he was born. They then went to Paraguay. So he grew up in a German-speaking enclave in South America with a bunch of Germans, not knowing that he was Jewish. And probably a bunch of those people in his community were the kind of people that we see in this movie. Age 14, his parents returned to England. For him to continue his schooling. And that's when they told him, oh, and by the way, you're Jewish. And I fled from the Nazis. So now this young man has this identity crisis, and he's trying to figure this out all of his life. And of course, that's why he started making films, not only about, documentaries about England. By the way, Luke was more English than the English. He lived in a little tiny village south of London called Ditchling in Surrey. And he loved to talk about his lifestyle there. But he was also a German-speaking, Spanish-speaking son of refugees. There was nobody more suited, not least because he was also the most engaging and affable person you could possibly imagine. Only Luke could walk into the home of a former SS and say, hi, do you want to have coffee? Let's talk. And so he did that, not once, not 15 times like you saw in the documentary, but 250 times to build this archive of people who were either in some part or other of the Nazi regime, or were affiliated, or were witnesses, like we saw, for example, the elderly people in the old people's home in the film. So that was Luke's journey. He did that, pursued that from 2008 to about 2016, which is when he took his last interview. He had been diagnosed with cancer once, made a full recovery, was diagnosed again, and unfortunately passed away just a few months after completing the film last year. And so that's how I got to know about the film. And all the way through this, Miriam, I was sort of his journeyman. I'm not a producer of the film. I was just his friend, watching from a distance and having conversation with him about the and viewing some of the interviews, many of which you don't see in the film, which I think will be material for us to learn about for many, many years to come.
Fascinating background and history. So now I turn to Michael and repeat the question. Remember when I contacted you and said, have you seen this film? Would you like to have a link? And you said, sure. And then I didn't speak to you again. So this is my first time to say to you, what was your first impression and what do you have to say about it?
I had two initial reactions. I'm going to ask Stephen after this, what don't we see? Which is the hand of the director. I had two initial reactions. The first was to remember a particular paradox of the Holocaust. Paradox of the Holocaust is that the innocent feel guilty and the guilty feel innocent. And that is that we had all of these people, and you did not hear much guilt whatsoever, no sense of perpetrator guilt, and no sense also that time and proximity to death brings one to account, and no sense that they were ready to account for what they had done. I'd seen this film the same day that I heard that my doctoral professor had died. And my doctoral professor was rewriting his autobiography at the age of 97, was rewriting his autobiography to reflect the way in which he now looked back at life when he had very few tomorrows and many, many yesterdays. And it was interesting to see the reworking of that and the reimagining of that, and I didn't hear that here. That was my first response. My second response was was only a pain in the neck historian like me could play with that. I had been writing a long magazine piece on Eichmann, and many years ago I edited for English language the police interrogations of Eichmann. And I took as the methodological point of view, not that Eichmann was lying, but Eichmann was revealing to us the lies he told himself. And that it was very important to understand what he was thinking about himself and what he was willing to share of that and how far that would take us and the like. So I expected to be able to grapple with this material with a whole range of justifications. And what I found most intriguing is there were very few justifications, and very little embarrassment. And that these men did this, and they didn't deny it. They accepted it as a normal, natural part of their reality and their world. And that surprised me in a very intriguing way. I also thought that Luke was both an excellent director and also an inquisitive interviewer. And I think, Stephen, you can bear that out. But let me ask Stephen a question. What don't we see that you would find more instructive than what we do see? And I'm asking that with a certain background because many years ago, I got to see the 250 hours of outtakes of Claude Lanzmann. And the only way you appreciate how magnificent a film, a documentary Shoah is to understand what he left on the cutting room floor, as it were. And consequently, the question, Stephen, is what did he leave behind that we don't see and that we should see?
Well, what I like about this project, Michael, which I think you will appreciate as a historian, is that Luke was very clear that this was an archive that would produce a film that would bring people to the archive. So in a sense, nothing gets left on the cutting room floor. It's all there to be discovered at some point, somewhere. And I think his intention was always that people like you, with that inquisitiveness that you just described, will go and find, what could be found there. What's missing in the documentary for me is Luke himself. You make a point that he's normally documentaries, as you know, you've been filmed countless times as the expert that helps to contextualize what's going on in the documentary. We don't see any Michael Berenbaums in Final Account. There's no expert context or commentary on what we're seeing. It's purely from the voice of the people that he interviewed. But what we're not seeing is how that information came about. And your sense is absolutely correct, Michael. He was a very curious and inquisitive person. You think about it, his grandparents were murdered by people like those that we're seeing in the film. So he could have gone in with a condemnation, pre-built-in condemnation or an emotional, sort of mission that he wanted to accomplish. He had the amazing ability to suspend that and to remain curious in the conversations with these individuals. Now,
methodologically, if we think of it and we take Lanzmann as the contrast, we see everything in Shoah filtered through Lanzmann. Right. Even when Lanzmann, you have captions below, so you don't need the translation, but we hear the statement, then we hear the translation of the statement, and then we hear the response. So in a very real sense, Lanzmann filters his film for us through his own sense of getting the film. And here Luke doesn't filter it. He takes himself out of it.
And very self-consciously, by the way, because I had
deliberately. Clearly it's deliberate.
Yeah, very conscious. I had a very sort of intense conversation with him actually at the St. Pancras train station. I remember it very well. We were discussing the film. I wasn't involved in the editorial at all, but as his friend, I was saying to him, Luke, I think we need to hear more of you, see more of you in this film, because these interviews would not exist without you. And he was conscious, by the way, of Lanzmann's insertion of himself in the films. And he wanted to do the reverse of that and allow these interviews to speak for themselves. The reason I think he's missing, though, is that he had an extremely good approach to how he went about these conversations, because of course these SS, even if they are not telling us the full truth and they are occluding the past and they are, in various levels of denial in terms of how they are speaking, and certainly to your point, there's nobody apologizing to anybody for their actions. Nevertheless, they are revealing things that they never revealed to any human being before. And some of that comes through the way in which he engaged these conversations. Or I'm looking at a question here from Oldies 2822. I hope that's because you were born in 28 and 22 and are 93 and 99 years old, in which case Mazel Tov. So Oldies, you asked the question, how did Luke find the perpetrators? And this is to your point, Michael. The gentleman, the man, I won't call him a gentleman, who's standing by the barn, describing how the prisoners escaped from Bergen-Belsen and hid in the barn. And then the following morning, he then calls the camp to return them. Luke literally is driving around Bergen-Belsen looking for old people. He sees an old guy. Excuse me, do you live around here? Do you always live around here? Oh yeah, I've been here for years. Okay, gets out of the car, starts a conversation with him. If he's living within several hundred yards of Bergen-Belsen and he's in his 90s, it's somebody to talk to. He then engages in friendly conversation on the side of the street, to the point at which the man then takes him to his place and shows him, and then you see him in the car, he's the tour guide of the region. And he's just talking to Luke. He doesn't realize at that point that when Luke finds out that these prisoners were in the barn, that when he asks the question, so how did you tell the camp authorities? Very simple question. Well, we called them. We called them to come and fetch the prisoners, which obviously was handing them back to almost certain death. That is an amazing technique. I have to say, as an oral historian, I wouldn't have the courage or the guts to do that. I call my candidates in advance. I make an appointment. I go. I fill out a form. He's meeting them on the street and then conducting these in situ. And I saw the outtakes of that, Michael, or at least the full interview, and the relationship between Luke and the individual standing by that barn was just a remarkable thing to watch. I wish
it reminds me, one of the fellows who died during COVID was a fellow by the name Bill Helmreich, who wrote a book against all odds, but he wrote a second book, which is he walked every block in New York City, 65,000 blocks. And what he did, he was a cultural anthropologist, and he engaged in a conversation on every block. Mm-hmm. And that is, his methodology was, I'm going to learn New York. I'm going to walk every block, the good blocks, the bad blocks, the tough blocks, the gang blocks, walked everywhere and had a conversation on each block. And working in vicinity of the camps, there was a fellow about 20 years ago who interviewed these people, but he didn't get them to speak on camera. What's different about interviewing people and speaking to them, even if you're taking notes, even if you're recording, is you're not seeing their faces. And here Luke was able to get them to speak on camera, to speak with their faces, and as it were, to give them their own posterity in a film, saying these things. And that's quite a remarkable achievement.
Yeah, was there something that stood out for you? You know, you're a historian.
And without, by the way, and without the interesting thing, again, in contrast to Lanzmann, who becomes one of the fundamental ground from which documentary filmmakers look at it. Lanzmann only did this secretly. Luke had to get them, as it were, to do it, to participate in archive. I presume he had release forms. I presume he had all of that. It's an absolutely incredible accomplishment. and also to walk in and to meet the perpetrator, the perpetrators, and not to have an advanced attitude.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And to restrain yourself is an incredible achievement.
There are some things, points that I expected him to include in this film, which aren't there. There's a remarkable interview, Michael, that you'll get to look at some point. It's of a Belgian volunteer, Waffen-SS. And the camera is on him, and a little like some of the individuals we saw in this film, he is protesting his innocence, moreover, protesting the innocence of the Fuhrer and of the whole operation, and basically saying that he's not going to bring the Third Reich into disrepute, and he's going to protect the honor of the Fuhrer and so forth. And he's yelling, and he's telling Luke to switch off the camera. And I can just see Luke sitting there. He doesn't move. The camera does not go off. And this goes on for about, I don't know, it must be a couple of minutes. He's really yelling at him. And eventually he calms down, he sits back in his chair, and then he describes what he did. I expected that to make the cut into this film, because for me, it was one of the most remarkable moments of oral history I've seen. I simply don't think I could have done that.
You and I both know, having done oral histories, the moment they tell you to switch off the camera is the moment you're going to hear something that's very, very, very important.
Right.
As we approach the 20-minute mark, I'd like to ask a couple of questions, and then I invite the participants who are on Facebook and YouTube and everywhere to put in their questions. You started to ask this, Stephen. You were going to say what was the most moment that stood out.
Yeah, I was going to ask Michael that, yeah.
For me, it was what you mentioned. I couldn't get over the farmer saying, we called the Nazis and told them they were here. And the narrator said, well, how do you feel about that now, knowing what happened to them? And he said, they were Jews. We were supposed to turn them in. And I thought, wow, to have this on screen, to have this piece of testimony is so important. Before we go to Michael, though, I do want to ask this question, because I'm sure the audience is wondering, what is your hope and goal and intent for this film, educationally and community-wise? What do you want for the world to know, for for people who watch it? What is your hope?
Well, it's great you asked that question, because obviously, Luke, who's no longer with us, and I hope he's looking down on us with pleasure as we watch this film, right, and see now the hard work he put into it. His intention was always to make the content, secure the content, and then open the door to us through this film. What I think he's inviting us all to do, and certainly what the Show Foundation will be doing as the education partner to the film, is trying to provide additional context for our classrooms, providing educational materials for it, and a gateway back into that archive so that you can explore it with safety. This is not a film you can just show to 15-year-olds and say, there you go, take a look at this, hope you can make sense of it. It really does need teacher education and context and other, for example, we use Holocaust survivor testimonies in the same education program, so that when they're talking about the Hitler Youth, for example, you can then go and hear what was the impact on those who were Jewish that experienced being bullied by the Hitler Youth or couldn't join the Hitler Youth and were excluded and so forth, so that the students get a chance to see all sides of that story and can be helped through the experience of encountering this kind of material in a meaningful way. So that's definitely what we'll be doing. I also hope scholars will use the archive once it's fully available, because I think with the minds of Michael and other historians, delving into this, I think there's a lot to be learned.
I would agree with you as a teacher trainer that is the approach that would work best. Michael, what would you feel as a historian that the world would get? Because this film is going to go worldwide, I believe, tomorrow. It's opening in theaters, not just in America, but in Europe as well. Is that correct, Stephen? Just in America.
Just in America is the first release. Europe will be later in the year. Yeah.
Well,
And of course,
I'll tell you an interesting response to this. And Stephen, you'll get a kick out of this. Many years ago, I attended a screening of Schindler's List in Germany. And I sat in the front row, not to watch the film, but to watch the audience. And the first thing, and when I go through museums, after I've seen a museum myself, my second view of a museum is to see it through the audience's eyes, to listen to comments, to be, as it were, a fly on the wall. My temptation in a film like this to see it would also be to see it and see the audience response, and also see the age differential between the audience response, between the young and old. And also, I think between, I would be intrigued in seeing this, for example, in the context of a military base of men and women who have known combat and who have seen the difficulties of that. So I'm intrigued by that. I certainly agree with Stephen that this should not go unfiltered to a student audience, because without knowing really about the Holocaust, I'm not sure what you can make of this. But I think once you see this, there's a rich material. And we've been asked, Stephen, how you access the archive. And it's not only a question that Mr. Oldie will ask, 2229 or 2922, but it's the first thing I want to ask after this, because I'm intrigued in looking at this material as well.
Yeah, so at the moment there is a view-only copy of the interviews, I believe up to about 2014, so it's not the full collection, that Luke lodged with the Wiener Library in London and the University College London, with the, I think Mary Fulbrook is the Department of History at UCL. So they both have a copy. Mary has started to do some cataloging with it. The Show Foundation is going to involve itself in helping to translate and subtitle material, because nearly all of it's in German. And we'll also be working with Luke and his estate to make sure that it's made available through the Show Foundation's platform in due course. But there needs to be some preparatory work done first so that it's searchable, because at the moment it's about 600 hours of mainly non-searchable material. The interviews themselves have been catalogued, and there are some basic keywords, but not in the sense that you might find in the Show Foundation's archive now, where it's all keyworded and transcribed and subtitled. So we want to work.
Let me ask you a question. Were it available to you, would you conceive of adding it to the Show Foundation's archive?
Yes, and in fact, here's an interesting fact, fun fact for you, Michael, because you're a former executive director of the Show Foundation. I wanted to bring it in as it was happening. The board of the Show Foundation has let me do absolutely everything that I took to them in the last 10 years, except bring this archive in. And the rationale in 2010 was because at the time we only had Holocaust testimonies and no means of filtering. So what happens if you type in propaganda and you get 10 former Nazis come up and 10 Jewish survivors? Are we comfortable with having Jewish survivors' testimonies alongside Nazi survivors? Now we have a different system. So in fact, we can isolate these testimonies as a separate search. So everybody's much more comfortable with that now. And that makes it possible to search them as an entity within their cell. And you're not going to bring up, you know, one's, but like, for example, we won't bring up Miriam's testimony alongside some SS and that they appear together. No. They'll appear as separate searches.
I think there's one other interesting element, which would have to be monitored, which is that the danger sometimes is everybody has a story and people begin to identify with that story. And the more you listen to it, the more you identify and the more you understand, the more you excuse. And I found this, my attitude when I was dealing with Eichmann's testimony, and I listened to many, many hours of Eichmann's testimony, my attitude was that the more I understood, the less I excused and the less I felt sympathy. But I wonder, and deciding to go through this, I wonder how I would respond to this material, especially 600 hours is overwhelming. 600 hours is, is 20 weeks of heavy work. And you and I know we'd need a little bit of vodka to go through that all the way through.
And I'll just say this, I know you want to go to Q&A, Miriam, but I will say, add to this, Michael, that when I first saw the first section of testimonies, interviews that Luke had conducted in around 2009-10, after an hour of watching probably 4 or 5 outtakes, long outtakes of them, I'd seen enough, because it's one thing when they're curated and edited as they are into this narrative in this film, which is difficult enough. When you watch them, in their raw form, and you see the chicanery and the subsuming of memories and the excusing of memories, but as a long linear line of denials, in addition to the fact this complete lack of, as you pointed out, because he wasn't interviewing them for them to confess. He was talking to them about their lives. So you see them as they are, and their lives are even those who've come to terms with what they did are still unrepentant. And so, it's pretty hard to watch. And
the other thing that intrigues me, though, Stephen, I wonder what your conclusion is about 20 years ago, there was a long debate in our field. Were these ordinary men, or did they have a certain range of characteristics about them? Were they ordinary Germans educated in essentially in eliminationist anti-Semitism to exterminationist anti-Semitism, to use technical terms? And then also the question, were they monsters or were they ordinary people when they did what they did? And my overwhelming impression is this gave us a sense of the ordinariness. And the intriguing thing, again, is to know what they did in the rest of their life, because chances are that they were law-abiding, decent citizens in the aftermath, and did not take up careers of crime, violence, and all of that. And it tells us something about the human capacity.
I wanted to, since reference was made to it, I want to urge the audience, whether you're watching tonight or tomorrow on your YouTube or Facebook, to Google the Shoah Foundation. I have worked very closely with them educationally. Every year, their education director, Corey Street, comes and trains our teachers. And I'm very proud that my own testimony is on the foundation website also. As a closing question, I wondered about the title, Final Account. Is it indeed the final account? And do you know why Luke chose that as the title? Stephen.
Okay, so first of all, he was very much at pains to say there was no definitive article in front of it. It's not the final account, it is just final account, if that makes a difference. Secondly, he named it that in 2008. That's the very first conversation I had with him. He said, I'm going to make an archive called Final Account. I want to hold them to account. These are not testimonies. He hadn't taken a single one at this point, by the way. These are not testimonies. They are accounts. They will be based around conversations. And I want to at least try and make sure that this generation is held to account by what they say. He had no idea at that point if he would be successful, but that's very clearly what he set out to do, which is why it carried on into the name of the film.
Well, I think it is a powerful film, and I congratulate the Shoah Foundation on being a partner and developing educational materials, and hopefully that I will be able to work with that with our teachers in Miami-Dade. Michael, do you have a final comment you want to make? And then Stephen, and if there are questions, we'll be more to answer them as we begin to get close to the end of this powerful and wonderful conversation. Michael?
I'm intrigued by the word final in the final account. These are men in their 80s and 90s, and therefore there's always something final about it. And the other is that there's an echo of another word used by the Germans, which is the final solution.
Mm.
So it intrigues me with the word final. It also intrigues me that I didn't see as much reflection. I'd also be interested again in what these men became, who they were. Were there any people who were in the types of professions that are given to reflection and that are given to, as it were, a final account? So it's an intriguing question, but I will certainly be a consumer of this archive. I have no doubt.
Stephen, final comments to the audience. People will be watching this. This will be on the Miami Jewish Film Festival website, on YouTube, and in the coming days, there'll be hundreds, if not thousands, from our experience. So what final words might you have to say about your involvement and what you hope to get?
I think the final words have to go to the filmmaker Luke Holland, who, is not here to talk to you himself, and who, put countless thousands and thousands and thousands of hours into making sure that this account is there for the future. And I think he had a single objective with this, which was not to give his voice, which we talked about earlier, or even to make this anything complete. But I think what he really wanted to do was to get us starting to ask new questions about this period of history and its meaning. And he said, what I want people to do is leave this film asking more questions than they came in. And I think certainly this conversation has shown that's the case. And
that he accomplished with me, that's for sure.
Yeah, we'll keep doing that in his memory and in his honor. Again,
I can't tell you how much this conversation has meant to me, working with my two colleagues that I've known for a long, long time. And so I want to thank you both for this wonderful conversation, and hope that we can perhaps have a follow-up after a few months when the rest of the nation has seen the film, and talk about the kind of comments that will come in after viewing the film. So with that, I say good night to you in LA. I think you're just getting your dinner time, and I'm ready for my bedtime. With that,
thank you for having us.
Thanks,
thank you very much. Good night.
Night, everyone. Bye.